Now, the African mining vision was adopted at the peak of the commodity boom. And a commodity boom which meant also that the terrain of competition for mineral resources had changed dramatically from when structural adjustment started kind of liberalizing Africa's mineral economies. I think the understanding of the bank and the fund and the bilateral donors at that time was that their companies and their economies would be the primary beneficiaries. But of course, new powers, particularly China, had emerged as industrial powerhouses, and therefore the competition for resources had become, very immense. And even among the global, the Western, the North Atlantic powers themselves, there's always been competition anyway for control. So the global struggle was between the owners of the resources and those who historically are benefited, as well as new entrants who wanted a share of this. And I think this context is an important context for the character of the AMV and some of the implementation challenges that it faced. Because from the point of view of the consuming countries, of course, they wanted certainty, sufficiency, and security of supply. And at various points in history, different things have been done. So you find that historically, there have been moments of consensus because the supplying countries want also to be sure about the economic reliability of their mineral exports. Even though they were dependent and wanted to transform it, that relationship existed. Secondly, there was also, you find that, so the thing swings from contestation to moments of consensus. And if you look through the period from before the creation of the MV, you would find that the contest, the demobilization of the nationalist agenda with structural adjustment meant that a number of things, also were put in place. But let me go back a bit just to make the point about kind of moments of convergence. I mean, in the mid 80s, when mineral prices were very low and countries were struggling, the EU, for example, set up something called SISMIN under the Lomé Agreement to support countries with their mineral revenue earnings as a way of keeping the sectors alive. That reflected their interest, of course, in continuity of supply. It wasn't wholly successful, and that also coexisted with a more global approach, which was about compensatory financing, which SISMIN, was not. Structural adjustment also went hand in hand with the removal of those things at the global level. So all those buffer stock ideas all disappeared. It all came down to, therefore, the logic of these frameworks. Now, when the MV came up, it was part of a push by exporting countries to gain greater control of their natural resources. The MV in this scope, of course, talked about industrialization all the way to improving the situation of mining affected communities, as well as improving revenue. Now, the challenge, and of course, those things reflected also struggles that were taking place on the ground. The point made earlier about the fact that national sovereignty did not include everybody, but even where it did, there were contests within the definition of the notion of the national interest. So within the mineral boom, we know that communities continue to struggle against the model. Workers continue to struggle. Activist groups questioned the handing over of public resources to transnational corporations. People questioned the amount of revenue that was being earned. People questioned the complicities and corruption involving governments and foreign companies and foreign governments and so on. So all these contests were taking place. And I think all these elements came to have a bearing on the mineral governance in a way which reinforced the agenda of the consuming powers, as well as laid the basis for a kind of AMV type agenda. Let me explain. Because even as structural adjustment has established a neoliberal regime, it was not simply through the market mechanisms, but also that this model needed some legitimizing, hegemonic ideas. So there are many issues people raise, whether it's community groups talking about the impacts and the need to respond to that, So you had kind of corporate social responsibility initiatives, whether it's people talking about the adequacy or accountability for revenue, which led to things like the EITI. The EITI and the associated publish what you pay, for example, meant that a very large group of NGOs became, shall we say, complicit in the stability and perpetuation of the FDI revenue-focused model of development, which the neoliberal agenda represented. So that level, at the level of society, of course, these were all reinforcing ideas. So you find a number of those kinds of mechanisms, which, whilst not being overtly controlling, stabilize the model that structural adjustment are created. So when you have things like, for example, like the Kimberley process around conflict diamonds, you dealt with the conflict and allowed the diamonds to continue to flow without challenging the structural situation of foreign companies, ownership. When you have things like the Dodd-Frank Act about, again, conflict and corruption, you dealt with the corruption, but this was not the structural challenge, to the model. So I'm saying that while these things address problems that we all agree on, within the framework of a neoliberal production regime, they became legitimating, kind of discourses. They became part of the hegemonic, I'll say the soft tissue of hegemonic discourses represented in economic and legal terms by the architecture of the agreements that were signed and the laws which countries passed. So come the push for clawing back control when the prices reached a peak. Suddenly, countries in Africa elsewhere were met with this kind of accusation of resource nationalism. Now, the resource nationalist pushback was very much what gave rise to the envy. Now, for people in the global south, resource nationalism is a beautiful thing because it's an assertion of your ownership. It's an assertion of taking back control of your non-renewable resources, whatever context they may be within the national space about control, because our elites definitely were complicit, with the stability, of the regime. But the resource nationalist threat gave rise to a number of responses. I mean, I think the assertiveness led to a number of things. First of all, the sufficiency, the reliability, and the security of supply thing meant that across the OECD, the North Atlantic powers, there's an important concern to ensure that you nail this thing down. So in the case of the European Union, the Raw Materials Initiative was rolled out in 2008. The Raw Materials Initiative, which basically, to quote Mandelson, who was the EU commissioner at the time, he said, the EU imports 70 to 80% of its primary resources. An open global market completely free of all distortions on trade and energy. Trade in energy and raw materials is a key goal of the EU's trade policy. So this was brought to bear in EU aid policy, in negotiating economic agreements like the Economic Partnership Agreement, and also in the initiatives that were pushed collectively by the G7 in the WTO. So they wanted things like export taxes and so on to be interdicted and stopped within the WTO. And you find that those clauses came to be represented in things like the Economic Partnership Agreements, outlawing of the use of subsidies and various mechanisms that would support industrial policy for process and diversification. All these things were attacked as a concerted part of Western policy, of which the EU Raw Materials Initiative was the most visible expression. But all the big powers had a critical minerals list that they saw as national security issues that they devote a lot of attention to ensuring that they were able to continue to get access to. Treasurer talked about the World Bank's $1 billion MAP initiative. Actually, we can list, I mean, that was the Raw Materials Initiative was the most aggressive expression of this guarantee of supply. There were a number of things which I think we can take as connected in terms of this approach. Because you see, something like the African Mining Vision represented a challenge to the neoliberal agenda that the World Bank had installed in Africa. The World Bank survives both through consultation and co-optation. So when criticism of structural adjustment was at its peak, the World Bank suddenly had a new vision. A world without poverty is our vision, away from responsibility for actually having created, the poverty. So the World Bank became an active actor around this whole, shall we say, resource nationalist agenda in Africa. It took part of the AMV thing and also began to fill into areas where, because of the resource weakness of African countries, there were no initiatives taking place. So the African Mining Legislation Atlas project, for example, the geomapping, that geological information thing that Treasure talked about. This was an EU World Bank cooperation to put together this map, which would guarantee a certain knowledge of African geological resources in the hands of the big powers. There were things, for example, so after the launch of the AMV, you found a number of initiatives which contain elements of the AMV type agenda. So African countries were pushing to renegotiate contracts. The G7 in its 2014 meeting in Brussels launched a contract renegotiation initiative to centralize technical support for contract renegotiation around something called CONEX, which the G7 was going to put money into, rather than giving, let's say, the money to the Africans to do their own thing. They set up a center. The World Economic Forum, for example, set up something called the Responsible Mineral Development Initiative in 2009. If you read the reasons that they gave for the initiative, it reads like the same reasons that led to the AMV. But the difference between CONEX and the World Economic Forum's Responsible Mineral Development Initiative on one side, and initiatives at the AMV, is that these dissented control of a reform agenda from the owners of the resource. That's the first point. Secondly, the AMV was a state society initiative within Africa. Something like the Responsible Mineral Development Initiative is a voluntary private sector initiative, but which was appealing to the same actors in Africa to be their partners. CONEX was, again, a G7 thing, going to be based, at the Valle Colombia Center and also in European institutions, not, in Africa. So whilst they appear to be doing the same things, it was actually a fragmentation of the political ownership of the thing and a decentering, of the ownership of the exercise. And furthermore, of course, it meant that who owned the agenda and controlled it was not around African countries. And because also the proclivities of African countries for taking aid wherever it came from, it meant that a lot of countries were going to rush, towards this initiative, which happened. So in 2014, for example, the presidents of Guinea and Ghana turned up at the World Economic Forum to heap praise on the World Economic Forum's Responsible Mineral Development Initiative, not a word about the African mining vision, in their speeches. So this is the kind of, so it was a combination of cherry picking, demobilization, appropriation in the name of actually offering support. But so at one level, it appears to be a unity, but there's also a fragmentation. So the point I'm making is that the struggle for control is not taking place simply through confrontational mechanisms like the raw material initiative, but they are soft initiatives which try to build hegemonic influences, but which also mobilize existing concerns and discourses. So I always cite the EITI as a very good example of that kind of thing. We are all for revenue transparency, but if you are against the primacy of revenue as a concern in minerals, you say that it's inadequate. If you also take the view that transparency is necessary for all processes, then you don't need a special mechanism for revenue, for example, okay? But a lot of NGO energy has been mobilized around revenue transparency, and African governments pay more attention to the EITI than they pay to the AMV, also because there's some aid money, around it, associated with some soft aid conditionalities. You take something like the Natural Resource Charter, which is centered in an international NGO. It's a private voluntary initiative, but it is given more attention by the World Bank due to things such as elaboration of the terms of the EITI, and also includes elements of what anybody looking at the MV will be interested in. So the proliferation of these initiatives, supported with resources, calling for the kind of diverting political attention, fragmenting energies, are very important ways in which the dominance of a certain kind of paradigm takes hold, which means that really challenging paradigms, because some of their elements also overlap with the existing paradigm, it becomes easy for the points of convergence and overlap to be picked on. So many African governments, for example, have driven very hard to get more revenue share from mining, which is correct. But you find that there's not a similar drive for greater accountability for the use of the resources. There's not a similar drive for the implementation of free, prior, informed consent, which is part of the African Mining Vision framework. So what I've tried to offer here is that the challenge to regain control by mineral owning countries is confronted by a spectrum of instruments, which range from the confrontational framework of the Raw Material Initiative. But even that framework uses various mechanisms, from the confrontational mechanisms to soft mechanisms like aid, cooperation, and so on, and kind of conditional things like the EPA. And then at the other end of the spectrum are seeming areas of cooperation and convergence on issues, but how to approach them, what they fit into, who owns the agenda, where are they centered, what is their legal status, and so on, all make a contribution to ensuring that overall challenges to the status quo have a hard time in getting traction and succeeding.